October 22nd, 1943. Hollywood Manor, West Kingsdown, Kent. The transmitter room hummed with electricity. Flight Sergeant David Hirschfeld adjusted his headset and leaned toward the microphone, his finger hovering over the transmission button. Through his receiver, German voices crackled across the night sky over Kassel. 300 miles away, Luftwaffe night fighters were climbing into darkness, hunting for the bomber stream that was about to devastate Germany's industrial heart. Hirschfeld cleared his throat and spoke in perfect Bavarian German. The voice of a man who had once called Munich home before fleeing Hitler's madness 3 years earlier. This was the moment everything changed. Hirschfeld was not a pilot in the traditional sense. He would never climb into a cockpit or feel the vibration of engines through his feet. But on this night, he would fly across Germany using nothing but radio waves and the sound of his voice. He would pilot German fighters away from British bombers, redirect them to empty skies, and send them home to land while RAF Lancasters burned their cities. He would do this without ever leaving the ground in Kent. This was Operation Corona, the beginning of the most audacious electronic warfare deception of the Second World War. A war fought not with bullets and bombs, but with voices, signals, and the human mind's capacity for confusion. The path to this moment had begun years earlier, in a war that was transforming faster than anyone had imagined. In 1940, as the Battle of Britain raged over southern England, the Royal Air Force discovered something extraordinary. They could hear the enemy talking, not intercepted messages decoded from encrypted transmissions, not captured documents or interrogated prisoners. They could literally hear German pilots speaking to each other and to their ground controllers in real time. The frequencies were unencrypted, the conversations raw and unfiltered, and the Germans were remarkably careless about what they said over those radios. RAF Kingsdown had been established in August 1940 in a converted toy factory on Falkham Road, about 20 miles south of London. It was positioned on high ground, 600 feet above sea level, perfect for intercepting radio transmissions across the English Channel. The station was officially designated as an Air Ministry wireless telegraph station, a deliberately vague cover for its true purpose. It was the headquarters of the RAF-WII service, a signals intelligence network that stretched from Scarborough in Yorkshire to Splte in Devon. WII service had been created to do what no intelligence organization had ever done before: listen to the enemy in real time and respond instantly. The early days were chaotic and improvised. The RAF purchased American Hallicrafters S-27 amateur radio receivers from shops in London because they had nothing else capable of detecting the German Lorenz beam frequencies, operating around 30 to 33 MHz. The receivers were fitted into Avro Anson aircraft and flown into German navigation beams to understand how they worked. On the ground, operators sat with headphones pressed to their ears, listening to static and fragments of German voices crackling through the atmosphere. The challenge was that nobody at Kingsdown spoke German. This problem was solved by accident. Then the RAF launched a recruiting drive across Britain, searching for anyone who could understand idiomatic and regional German. They found what they were looking for among refugees who had fled Nazi Germany before the war, German Jews who had escaped persecution and found safety in Britain. These were people who spoke German with perfect accents, who understood the nuances of Bavarian dialect versus Prussian formality, who could recognize the difference between a Wehrmacht officer and a Luftwaffe NCO simply by tone and vocabulary. By the time the Battle of Britain began in July 1940, RAF Kingsdown had assembled a team of German-speaking Women's Auxiliary Air Force members and RAF operators who monitored every German radio frequency they could find. What they heard was astonishing. German pilots routinely mentioned the number of aircraft in their formations, their destinations, their fuel status, their tactical intentions. They complained about the weather, they cursed their equipment, they radioed back to base about what they could see on the ground. They did all of this in clear, unencrypted voice transmissions that could be heard by anyone with the right equipment tuned to the right frequency. This carelessness wasn't stupidity, it was necessity. Encrypting voice communications in 1940 required massive equipment that couldn't be fitted into aircraft. The famous German Enigma machine was about the size of a typewriter and required careful operation to encode text messages. Voice encryption technology existed, but demanded huge vacuum tube installations suitable only for ground-based or ship-based communications. Fighter pilots flying at 300 miles per hour in cramped cockpits had no time or space for encryption devices. They needed to communicate instantly with their controllers and with each other, so they talked in the clear and hoped the British weren't listening. The British were listening. And by late 1940, they weren't just listening. Information flowed from Kingsdown to RAF Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory in minutes. German formations assembling beyond radar range could be detected by their radio chatter. Controllers at Kingsdown could identify whether incoming raids consisted of fighters or bombers based on engine noise and pilot conversations. They could hear orders being passed to fighter escorts, revealing which targets were primary and which were secondary. They could detect meeting points and return routes. All of this intelligence reached British commanders in time to vector Spitfires and Hurricanes to intercept the raiders before they reached their targets. But listening was only the first step. In 1941, the RAF began experimenting with something far more aggressive. If they could hear German transmissions, could they interfere with them? Could they jam frequencies, disrupt communications, confuse enemy pilots? The answer was yes, but it required infrastructure that didn't yet exist. The RAF needed powerful transmitters capable of reaching deep into German-controlled airspace. They needed to understand exactly which frequencies the Luftwaffe used and when they used them. And they needed operators skilled enough to recognize German tactical procedures and exploit their weaknesses. Through 1941 and 1942, the infrastructure was built piece by piece. Kingsdown moved from the cramped toy factory to Hollywood Manor in early 1941. A larger facility with space for 3 90-foot antenna masts. A secondary station was established at Rotham, 3 miles down the A2T road, with a massive 240-foot mast that could reach across the channel into occupied Europe. With help from Cable and Wireless, the General Post Office and the BBC, the RAF developed high-power transmitters that could bounce signals off the ionosphere deep into Germany. These transmitters were controlled by landline from Kingsdown, allowing operators to broadcast from Rugby and Leafield while coordinating directly with intelligence officers in Kent. Different German units used different frequencies. The Luftwaffe operated primarily in 2 bands, high frequency between 3 and 6 MHz and very high frequency between 38 and 42 MHz. Ground-to-air communications could switch frequencies rapidly to avoid jamming. German operators were trained to recognize interference and change channels immediately. The RAF had to develop receivers sensitive enough to track these frequency changes and transmitters powerful enough to jam them before the Germans could escape to clear spectrum. By early 1943, RAF Bomber Command was mounting increasingly devastating raids on German cities. The bomber streams consisted of hundreds of heavy aircraft, Avro Lancasters, Handley Page Halifaxes, Short Stirlings, 4-engine behemoths carrying tons of high explosives and incendiaries. These raids were designed to destroy Germany's industrial capacity and break civilian morale. But they came at terrible cost. German night fighters equipped with radar could find the bomber streams in darkness and shoot them down with devastating efficiency. RAF losses sometimes exceeded 5% per mission. On bad nights, 10% or more of the attacking force failed to return. Something had to change. The RAF needed to disrupt German fighter control networks, confuse their radar operators, jam their communications, and mislead their pilots. In October 1943, all these threads came together in Operation Corona. The concept was simple and audacious. German-speaking RAF operators would monitor Luftwaffe fighter control frequencies during bombing raids. When they heard German controllers directing night fighters toward the bomber stream, the RAF operators would break into the frequency and countermand those orders. They would impersonate Luftwaffe controllers, speaking with perfect German accents and using authentic military vocabulary. They would give false instructions designed to pull fighters away from the bombers, order pilots to land immediately because of weather conditions, direct them to patrol areas where no British aircraft were operating, create confusion about which frequencies were operational, read Hitler speeches at critical moments to disrupt communications. The Germans would hear what sounded like legitimate orders from their own commanders and have no way to know they were being deceived. The technical implementation was extraordinary. At Hollywood Manor, operators sat in a room filled with receivers and transmitters. They wore headphones that let them monitor multiple German frequencies simultaneously. In front of them were oscilloscopes showing wave patterns dancing across cathode ray tubes. When they identified a German controller giving tactical instructions, they noted the frequency and the nature of the orders. Then they used high-power transmitters at Rugby and Leafield to broadcast their own instructions on the same frequency, overwhelming or confusing the legitimate German signal. The human element was just as critical. The operators had to speak perfect German. Not textbook German learned in school, but natural colloquial German with regional accents. They needed to understand Luftwaffe terminology, radio procedures, tactical doctrine. They had to recognize the difference between a controller directing multiple aircraft and a pilot reporting his status. They had to think like German officers, anticipate what orders would sound plausible, and deliver their deceptions with complete confidence. Any hesitation, any accent inconsistency, any procedural error would alert the Germans that something was wrong. Flight Sergeant David Hirschfeld was one of the first. He had fled Germany in 1938 after Kristallnacht, arriving in Britain with nothing but the clothes he wore and the language he spoke. He joined the RAF in 1940 and spent 3 years listening to German radio traffic before Operation Corona began. He knew Luftwaffe procedures better than most Luftwaffe controllers. He could recognize individual pilots by their voices. He understood the psychology of men flying in darkness, hunting for bombers, exhausted by hours of flight, desperate for clear instructions from someone who sounded like they knew what they were doing. The first Corona operation launched on the night of October 22, 1943. The target was Kassel, a major industrial center in central Germany. 569 RAF bombers were dispatched. The attack would employ the latest tactics, including Pathfinder aircraft marking the target with colored flares, main force bombers following behind to drop high explosives and incendiaries in a concentrated wave. The goal was to create a firestorm, a self-sustaining inferno that would consume the entire city. Corona's job was to keep German night fighters away long enough for the bombers to complete their work and escape. As the bomber stream crossed into German airspace, Luftwaffe controllers began vectoring fighters toward the threat. At Kingsdown, operators heard the instructions clearly. Night fighters from bases across northwestern Germany were scrambling, climbing to intercept altitude, being given courses that would bring them into contact with the British bombers. Then Hirschfeld pressed his transmission button and spoke into the microphone in front of him. His first transmission was simple, a routine frequency check that sounded completely normal. German pilots responded, confirming they could hear him. Hirschfeld then began issuing new instructions. He ordered fighters to change to different frequencies for better reception. When they complied, he followed them to the new frequencies and continued his deception. He gave false altitude reports for the bomber stream, sending fighters too high or too low. He ordered pilots to patrol specific areas well away from where the actual bombers were flying. He created confusion about which radar plots were accurate and which were spurious. The real German controllers realized something was wrong within minutes. They began ordering their pilots to ignore unauthorized instructions and maintain only legitimate contact. But in the chaos of a major night battle with hundreds of aircraft in the air and multiple controllers trying to coordinate a complex interception, it was impossible to tell which voice was legitimate and which was fake. The Germans had no secure way to verify identity. Radio procedures alone weren't enough. The Corona operators knew those procedures as well as any German controller. The Luftwaffe responded by switching frequencies repeatedly. The Corona operators followed them. The Germans tried using code words. The Corona operators had been listening to German traffic for 3 years and recognized the codes. Some German controllers tried giving orders very quickly to make interception difficult. The Corona operators could think and speak at the same speed. The battle in the ether became a deadly game of cat and mouse with fighter pilots caught in the middle, unable to tell who to obey. Over Kassel that night, the results were devastating. The RAF bombers faced less fighter opposition than expected. When fighters did make contact, they often seemed confused about the bomber stream's location and altitude. Some German pilots reported hearing conflicting orders and chose to return to base rather than risk following false instructions. The bombing itself was catastrophically effective. The Pathfinders marked the target accurately. The main force delivered over 1,800 tons of high explosives and incendiaries in a concentrated attack lasting less than an hour. A firestorm developed exactly as planned. 90% of Kassel's city centre was destroyed. 10,000 civilians died. 150,000 were made homeless. Only 27 RAF bombers were lost, less than 5% of the attacking force. For a raid of this size against a major target, that was an extraordinarily low loss rate. The Germans knew immediately that something new and dangerous was happening. Their fighter controllers reported unauthorized transmissions interfering with operations. Pilots complained about conflicting orders. Radar operators noted that fighters were being vectored away from known bomber tracks. Within days, the Luftwaffe began investigating what they called ghost voices on their frequencies. But they had no effective countermeasure. The RAF operators spoke perfect German, used correct procedures, and broadcast with enough power to override or confuse legitimate transmissions. The only way to verify authenticity was through face-to-face contact or encrypted communication, neither of which was possible in the middle of a night fighter battle. The German response was pragmatic and desperate. By mid-November 1943, the Luftwaffe made a dramatic change. They replaced male fighter controllers with female controllers. The logic was simple. Female voices were distinctive and relatively rare in German military communications. Pilots would immediately recognize a woman's voice as legitimate, because the Corona operators were surely men, and men couldn't convincingly imitate women's voices in the stress of combat operations. The Germans were wrong. At Kingsdown, the RAF immediately responded by deploying women's auxiliary air force operators into Corona missions. These women had the same qualifications as their male counterparts, native German speakers who had fled Hitler's regime, now using their voices to fight back. They stepped up to the microphones and began giving orders to Luftwaffe night fighters in perfect German female voices that sounded exactly like the legitimate controllers. The psychological impact was profound. German fighter pilots found themselves unable to trust any voice they heard on the radio. Was the woman directing them toward the bomber stream genuine, or was she British? Was the male controller ordering them to land an actual Luftwaffe officer or an RAF deceiver? The fundamental system of trust that made fighter control possible had been shattered. Pilots began relying more heavily on their own radar and less on ground controllers. But that made them more vulnerable to other RAF countermeasures, including window strips of aluminum foil dropped from bombers that created false radar echoes and blinded German radar operators. Operation Corona evolved throughout late 1943 and into 1944. The operators at Kingsdown became increasingly sophisticated. They learned to track individual German controllers and imitate their speech patterns. They discovered that different Luftwaffe units used slightly different procedures and terminology. They found that creating confusion at critical moments was more effective than maintaining constant interference. A single false order delivered at exactly the right time could disrupt an entire interception. They developed tactics like ordering all fighters to land during the peak of a bomber attack, claiming weather conditions or fuel shortages made continued operations impossible. They broadcast Hitler speeches on tactical frequencies during crucial coordination periods, forcing controllers to cease operations while they cleared the interference. The Germans attempted numerous countermeasures. They tried using women exclusively as controllers. The RAF matched them with women operators. They implemented code word authentication systems. The Corona operators learned the codes from listening to traffic. They tried rapid frequency hopping, switching channels every few minutes. The RAF operators followed them across the spectrum. They attempted to jam the British transmissions, but the Corona broadcasts originated from multiple sites with enormous power and could overwhelm German jamming attempts. Nothing worked. The fundamental problem was that voice radio communication cannot be secured without encryption technology, and that technology was too bulky and complex for aircraft use in 1943. The broader electronic warfare campaign expanded dramatically. In October 1943, the same month Corona began, RAF Bomber Command introduced Airborne Cigar, codenamed ABC. This system placed a special operator aboard Lancaster bombers of 101 Squadron with equipment to detect and jam German night fighter frequencies from the air. The ABC operator, referred to simply as a special, sat in the cramped fuselage with a receiver and 350-watt transmitters. His job was to identify German fighter control frequencies using a small cathode ray tube oscilloscope and then jam them by broadcasting noise or false signals directly from within the bomber stream. The combination of ground-based Corona and airborne ABC created a multi-layered deception network. German controllers tried to direct fighters toward the bombers, only to find their frequencies jammed by ABC aircraft or confused by Corona operators on the ground. When they switched frequencies to escape jamming, Corona operators followed them. When they tried to coordinate multiple fighters for a coordinated attack, ABC jamming disrupted their communications. The night fighters that did reach the bomber stream often found themselves alone, unable to coordinate with other aircraft, cut off from ground controllers, operating on instinct and radar in a sky full of false echoes and conflicting information. The human cost of these operations was significant on both sides. RAF bomber crews continued to die in substantial numbers despite Corona and ABC. German night fighters still found targets, flak still filled the sky over German cities with explosive shells, but the loss rates were lower than they would have been without electronic warfare support. Every bomber that returned to base was 7 men who lived to fly another mission. Every German fighter vectored away from the bomber stream was dozens of bomber crew members who survived because they weren't intercepted. For the Corona operators themselves, the experience was surreal and psychologically complex. They sat in relative safety in Kent while speaking into microphones that commanded life and death 300 miles away. When a Corona operator successfully redirected a German fighter away from the bomber stream, he knew he might have saved British lives. But he also knew that the German pilot he deceived might crash trying to follow false instructions, or might be shot down by another RAF aircraft while confused about his position. The operators heard German pilots die over their headsets, heard them scream when their aircraft were hit, heard the terror in their voices as they fought for control, heard the silence when they disappeared from the frequency forever. David Hirschfeld later described the psychological burden of this work. He knew the pilots he was deceiving, not personally, but intimately. He had listened to them for years. He recognized their voices, knew their call signs, understood their personalities. Some were arrogant, some were frightened, some were competent professionals doing their duty. And Hirschfeld was lying to them, deliberately misleading them, trying to get them killed or at least rendered ineffective. He was fighting a war with his voice against men who would never know his name, never see his face, never understand that the Bavarian accent giving them orders belonged to a Jewish refugee from Munich who was hunting them with radio waves. The broader strategic impact of Corona and the entire RAF electronic warfare campaign was substantial. By early 1944, German night fighter effectiveness had declined dramatically despite improvements in radar and weapons. The combination of window, Corona, ABC, and other countermeasures meant that Luftwaffe fighters struggled to find and intercept bomber streams consistently. RAF loss rates, which had peaked above 10% in late 1943, dropped to 5% or lower by mid-1944. This allowed Bomber Command to mount even larger and more destructive raids with sustainable casualties. The intelligence gathered at Kingsdown proved invaluable beyond Corona operations. WWII service operators monitoring German transmissions identified new radar systems before they became operational. They detected the development of the Liechtenstein BDC airborne intercept radar by hearing German pilots discuss problems with new equipment during training flights. When frustrated pilots violated radio discipline and talked about Emil code words, WWII service operators identified it as a designation for airborne radar. This intelligence allowed British scientists to develop jamming equipment and countermeasures before the German systems achieved full effectiveness. On the night of December 3, 1942, a specially equipped Wellington bomber from 1474 flight deliberately flew as bait to test German night fighter radar. The aircraft carried Special Duty Operator Pilot Officer Harold Jordan, a former schoolmaster from Croydon, who monitored a receiver looking for German radar emissions. When a German night fighter began tracking the Wellington, Jordan detected signals at 492 MHz and coded a message describing the frequency. The Wellington escaped, and the information reached British scientists who used it to develop countermeasures against the Liechtenstein radar system. When a German Ju-88R.1 night fighter defected and landed at RAF Dice in Scotland in April 1943 with Liechtenstein equipment aboard, British engineers confirmed Jordan's findings and built jamming systems that rendered the German radar largely ineffective. This cat-and-mouse game of detection and countermeasure characterized the entire electronic warfare campaign. The Germans would deploy a new system. British intelligence would detect it through signals intercept or captured equipment. British scientists would develop countermeasures. The Germans would respond with a new system. The cycle repeated endlessly, with both sides pushing the boundaries of radio and radar technology. The British advantage was their superior integration of intelligence, science, and operations. Information flowed quickly from WWII service operators to the telecommunications research establishment at Malvern, where scientists like R.V. Jones analysed the data and developed responses. Those responses reached operational squadrons within months, sometimes weeks. R.V.E. Jones, the brilliant young scientist who led British scientific intelligence, understood the strategic implications of electronic warfare better than almost anyone. He recognized that radio and radar were not just tools but battle spaces where wars could be won or lost. He orchestrated the capture of German equipment through operations like the Bruneville raid in February 1942, where British commandos assaulted a German radar installation on the French coast and stole key components. He directed the development of countermeasures against German navigation beams during the Blitz, causing Luftwaffe bombers to miss their targets by miles. And he provided critical support to Corona and WWII service, ensuring they had the scientific backing to understand and exploit German electronic systems. By D-Day in June 1944, RAF electronic warfare capabilities had reached extraordinary sophistication. On the night of June 5-6, as Allied forces prepared to land in Normandy, the entire force of ABC-equipped Lancasters was deployed to protect a dissection operation. RAF flying fortresses dropped window in patterns designed to look like a massive paratrooper landing near Pas-de-Calais, far from the actual landing beaches. The ABC aircraft jammed every German attempt at air interception, rendering Luftwaffe night fighters completely ineffective. Meanwhile, Corona operators broadcast misleading information about Allied movements, adding to German confusion about where the invasion would occur. The deception was so successful that German commanders continued to believe the main invasion was coming at Pas-de-Calais, even after Allied forces were firmly established in Normandy. Operation Corona continued until May 1945, the day Germany surrendered. For 19 months, German-speaking RAF and WAII operators sat at their posts in Hollywood Manor, speaking into microphones, hunting German voices across radio frequencies, giving false orders, creating confusion, saving lives. The operation's records are preserved in the British National Archives, documenting one of the most unusual combat roles of the Second World War. The operators never fired weapons, they never climbed into aircraft or faced anti-aircraft fire, but they fought a war nonetheless, using intelligence, language, technology, and psychology as their weapons. The broader legacy of electronic warfare pioneered during World War II is incalculable. Every principle of signals, intelligence, electronic countermeasures, and radio deception developed between 1940 and 1945 remains fundamental to modern military operations. The basic concepts of WWII service monitoring enemy communications, identifying patterns, exploiting procedural weaknesses are now standard practice for every military force. The integration of signals intelligence with operational planning that allowed Corona to function effectively established patterns that continue in modern joint warfare. The technology has evolved beyond recognition, with digital encryption and frequency, hopping spread-spectrum communications making simple voice deception impossible. But the fundamental insight remains: control of the electromagnetic spectrum is as important as control of land, sea, or air. For the German-speaking refugees who operated Corona, the operation represented something deeply personal beyond its military significance. These were people who had fled Hitler's Germany, often losing everything they owned, frequently separated from family members who would later die in concentration camps. Many were Jewish refugees who had escaped the Holocaust by pure chance, arriving in Britain with no money, no connections, and no prospects beyond survival. The RAF gave them a way to fight back. They couldn't return to Germany to rescue their families. They couldn't stop the death camps or prevent the Holocaust. But they could use their German language skills and their intimate knowledge of German culture to fight Hitler's military forces. They could sit at microphones in Kent and speak the language of their childhood to deceive the pilots of the regime that had destroyed their lives. David Hirschfeld, if he existed in the way he is represented here, would have known this meaning. Every false order he gave to a German pilot was a small act of resistance against the regime that had forced him to flee his home. Every successful deception that pulled fighters away from the bomber stream was a tiny contribution to the defeat of Nazi Germany. He could never know how many lives he saved, British or German. He could never know if the bombers he helped protect went on to destroy factories producing weapons for the Eastern Front, where those weapons might have killed Soviet soldiers fighting to liberate the concentration camps. The chains of causation in warfare are too complex to trace. But he knew that he was fighting, using the only weapons he had, his voice, his knowledge, his willingness to deceive. The Germans never fully solved the corona problem. They tried everything they could imagine. New procedures, new codes, new equipment, new training. Nothing worked effectively. The fundamental issue was that voice radio communication requires trust, and corona destroyed that trust. When a fighter pilot cannot believe the voice of his controller, the entire fighter control system breaks down. The Germans were forced to rely more heavily on autonomous operations, with pilots using their own radar and judgment rather than ground control. But that made them less effective, less coordinated, less able to mass fighters against bomber streams. The disintegration of German night fighter effectiveness in 1944 had many causes. American escort fighters shooting down experienced German pilots, fuel shortages grounding aircraft, the overwhelming scale of Allied bombing forcing dispersed defenses. But corona played its role in that collapse, a relentless psychological pressure that made German pilots doubt every voice they heard. After the war, many of the corona operators returned to civilian life and never spoke about their wartime service. The operation remained classified for decades. Even family members often didn't know what their relatives had done during the war. The records were sealed. The participants were bound by the Official Secrets Act. It wasn't dramatic work that could be easily explained. No dogfights, no bombing raids, no dramatic escapes. Just hours sitting in a room in Kent, wearing headphones, listening to German voices, and speaking German words into a microphone connected to transmitters that reached across hundreds of miles. But in its own quiet way, it was as important as any other contribution to the Allied victory. The technical systems that enabled corona, the sensitive receivers, the powerful transmitters, the understanding of radio propagation became foundations for post-war communications technology. The same principles used to jam German frequencies and broadcast false information across the ionosphere would later enable long-distance radio broadcasting, satellite communications, and eventually the global telecommunications networks that connect the modern world. The operators who monitored German frequencies and learned to identify signals in noise pioneered techniques that evolved into modern signals intelligence agencies. The integration of human intelligence, technical systems, and rapid operational response demonstrated at Kingsdown established patterns for information warfare that continue today. By any measure, Operation Corona was one of the most successful deception operations of World War II. It operated for 19 months without being effectively countered. It contributed to reduced RAF bomber losses during the most critical period of the strategic bombing campaign. It demonstrated that electronic warfare could be as important as physical combat, and it proved that refugees fleeing persecution could become some of their adopted country's most valuable warriors, using the very cultural knowledge that made them targets for genocide as weapons against the regime that sought to destroy them. The ghost voices that haunted German fighter pilots from October 1943 to May 1945 were real people sitting at microphones in Kent. People who had lost homes, families, countries. People who spoke the language of the enemy because it had once been their language too. People who fought a war with their voices and won victories that saved thousands of lives. The Luftwaffe pilots who heard those voices never knew who was deceiving them. Never knew that the Bavarian accent giving them false orders belonged to a man who had once walked the streets of Munich. Never knew that the woman's voice redirecting them away from the bomber stream belonged to a woman who had once lived in Berlin before fleeing for her life. This was the hidden war in the ether, fought with invisible weapons across invisible battlefields. A war where the sounds of voices carried more power than the thunder of bombs, where knowing the right words in the right accent at the right moment could mean the difference between life and death for hundreds of men in aircraft scattered across the night sky, where refugees became warriors without ever holding weapons, using language and knowledge and deception as their tools. The pilots who used enemy aircraft radio signals to trick the Luftwaffe were not pilots in the conventional sense. They were linguists, intelligence officers, technical operators, psychologists. They were refugees who had fled persecution and found a way to fight back. They were men and women who understood that warfare had evolved beyond simple physical combat into something more complex and more sophisticated. They understood that control of information could be as decisive as control of territory, that the human voice, amplified by technology and empowered by knowledge, could reach across hundreds of miles to confuse, deceive, and defeat an enemy who never saw them coming. In the end, this is what warfare had become by 1943. Not just tanks and aircraft and bombs, but signals and voices and electronic pulses racing through the atmosphere at the speed of light. Not just soldiers killing soldiers, but operators deceiving operators, voices lying to voices, systems designed to create confusion and doubt in the minds of men trying to fight in darkness. The technology was primitive by modern standards. The transmitters were huge and power-hungry. The receivers were barely adequate. The antennas were massive structures of wood and metal. But the principles were sound, and the results were real. Every modern military force now fights in the electromagnetic spectrum, the way World War II forces fought on land and sea. Electronic warfare officers monitor enemy communications, jam hostile radar, deceive adversary sensors, and protect friendly systems from interference. The technology has evolved through multiple generations of advancement. But the fundamental insight pioneered at RAF Kingsdown in 1943 remains unchanged. The voice of authority can be imitated, the signals of command can be falsified, and an enemy who cannot trust what they hear cannot fight effectively. David Hirschfeld and his colleagues, whether they were exactly these individuals or represented the dozens of real operators who performed this work, understood this truth before most military leaders accepted it. They sat at their microphones and spoke German words that saved British lives and shortened the war. They listened to men die and knew that their deceptions had consequences measured in blood and fire. They carried the psychological burden of being warriors who fought with lies, of being refugees who used their native language as a weapon against their native country, of being people caught between two identities in the most profound way possible. This is the story that history forgot for decades because it was classified and because it was too strange to fit conventional narratives of World War II. No dramatic aerial combat, no heroic last stands, no visible courage under fire, just people sitting in rooms with headphones and microphones, speaking words carefully chosen to deceive and confuse. But it was warfare nonetheless, fought with the most powerful weapon humans have ever developed, language itself. The ability to communicate, the ability to lie, the ability to use knowledge of culture and psychology to make an enemy doubt everything they hear. The Germans never found Hollywood Manor. They never bombed Kingsdown into rubble, though it sat in Bomb Alley and was hit by V-1 flying bombs that destroyed buildings and killed personnel. The Corona operators were never captured, never interrogated, never had to explain themselves to the men they had deceived. They simply sat at their stations night after night, speaking into the darkness, sending their voices across occupied Europe on radio waves that traveled faster than sound and carried more power than bombs. Some of them probably never spoke German again after the war ended. The language that had saved their lives by giving them valuable skills to offer their adopted country was also the language of their trauma, the language of the regime that had murdered their families and destroyed their homes. Others may have continued to use it, teaching it to new generations or working in translation, but they all carried the knowledge of what they had done during the war, of the unique and strange role they had played in one of history's great conflicts. Operation Corona demonstrated that modern warfare would never again be purely physical, that controlling what the enemy hears can be as important as controlling what the enemy sees, that deception can be as powerful as destruction, that refugees fleeing genocide can become the most effective warriors against the forces that persecuted them, not by matching violence with violence, but by using their unique knowledge and skills in ways their persecutors never anticipated. This is the legacy of the voices in the night, the ghost controllers who haunted Luftwaffe pilots, the refugees who fought with language, and the electronic warfare pioneers who understood that the future of conflict lay not just in physical dominance but in information dominance. Every time a modern military force jams enemy communications, broadcasts false information, or deceives adversary sensors, they are following in the footsteps of the corona operators who sat in Hollywood Manor and spoke German words into microphones that reached across the night sky to confuse and defeat Hitler's air force. The war in the ether was won not with superior firepower, but with superior knowledge. Knowledge of language, of psychology, of technology, of the enemy's procedures and vulnerabilities. It was won by people who understood that the human need to trust what we hear, to believe voices that sound authoritative, could be exploited in warfare. It was won by refugees who had every reason to hate the country that had persecuted them, and who found a way to strike back using the very cultural knowledge that had made them targets. This was the war that David Hirschfeld and his colleagues fought. A war of voices and signals and electromagnetic radiation dancing across the ionosphere. A war where victory was measured in bombers that returned safely, in fighter pilots who landed confused and empty-handed, in communications networks disrupted at critical moments. A war where the weapons were words spoken in perfect German, by people who had fled Germany to save their lives and returned in the only way they could, through radio waves that carried their voices back to the country that no longer wanted them. And in the darkness over Kassel, on October 22, 1943, when Hirschfeld pressed his transmission button and spoke his first deceptive order into the night, he became part of a new kind of warfare that would define conflicts for the next century and beyond. A warfare where information is power, where deception is strategy, where the voice of authority can be imitated and exploited, where the electromagnetic spectrum is a battlefield as important as land or sea or air. He couldn't have known all of this in that moment. He was simply following orders, using his skills, trying to help bombers return safely to their bases in England. But in that moment, he and his colleagues changed warfare forever. They proved that the human voice, amplified by technology and empowered by knowledge, could reach across vast distances to deceive and defeat an enemy who had better aircraft, more experienced pilots, and sophisticated radar systems. They proved that refugees could be warriors, that language could be a weapon, that electronic warfare could be as decisive as physical combat. They proved that in the modern age, controlling what the enemy hears is as important as controlling what the enemy sees or where the enemy goes. This is what the future of warfare would become. And it started in a manor house in Kent, with German-speaking refugees sitting at microphones, fighting Hitler's air force with the only weapons they had, their voices, their knowledge, and their courage to deceive.